Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Yalda Hakim, and I'm the Chief Foreign Affairs presenter at Sky News. And it's a great honor and privilege to be here with you today to talk about the challenges that we face in the media at the moment. I'd like to thank the former president for his inspiring words. I particularly, what I took away from that was this notion that misunderstandings can really lead to escalation, and that we need to have more conversations rather than take things in the wrong way. And that this wasn't just about Putin or Stalin, but a system that the international community needs to work with to help reform, whether that's in Russia or in China. Propaganda, misinformation, disinformation, fake news has existed since the beginning of time. Governments, people in positions of power have used these tools to flood the zone, distract, further advance their own political needs and to influence and shape their societies. I think what's unprecedented in the times that we're currently living in is the fact that there are tools now that spread this information at quite a fast pace. So whether that's AI-generated misinformation or social media. When radio was first created, the intelligentsia said that this is something that is deeply alarming to them, that it was reaching inside people's homes and shaping their thinking. When television was created, they said the same thing. And now we're concerned about the rise of social media, where we think that the idea of truth itself is being questioned. So we're going to be talking about these issues with our expert panel here this morning. Joining me now is Dr. Ott Velsberg, Chief Data Officer, the Ministry of Justice and Digital Affairs for the Government of Estonia. Welcome. Mitali Mukherjee, Acting Director, Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. Really good to see you, Mitali. And Dagmara Szulce, Global Managing Director at the International Advertising Association. Thank you all for joining us here on the panel. Ott, I'm going to begin with you, because I think while we don't want to do what David said and turn this into a whinge fest about the current state of play on the planet, I just want to talk a little bit about diplomacy via social media, which is what we've seen at play over the course of the last 24 hours. We know it's a tool that the President of the United States uses. He used it during Trump 1, and he's using it at the moment. I just wonder, as someone who works within government, how you deal with that. How does one manage that? Certainly when we see him put out statements like the President of Ukraine is a dictator, for example, or he started the war, you shouldn't have started the war, you're going to be left without a country. When that kind of diplomacy takes place on social media, how are you as a government sort of thinking about how to deal with it, how to respond to it?
So, first of all, it really depends on the topic itself. So, we oftentimes address things that the media also picks up as well. So, unfortunately, today social media plays a critical role, similarly for our communication strategy as well. So, the messages that you want to spread, things that you want to address. So, it's part of our communication plan itself. So, for instance, in our own case, we have different target groups depending on the social media platforms who we want to outreach, whether it's a global audience or a local audience. So it's really about branding. When it comes to the specific aspects that any kind of politician or anyone else addresses, it depends on the topic, really. So do you want to address it or not? I think we are sometimes so used to that we don't take things said in the social media anymore kind of as a truth or something that we need to actually kind of pay any attention to. And at the same time, what we see is that when we have previously in Estonia taught everyone in the schools kind of media literacy. Then data and AI literacy is a topic that we need to kind of start paying attention a lot more. So for us, we set out that by 2030, at least 80% elementary data and AI skills should be covered for the whole of society, because today, kind of critical thinking, what is truth, what is not, becomes more and more important.
Do you find that people are finding it challenging to decipher between what is fake news, what is the truth? Are they struggling to find the difference between those two things?
Absolutely, and it's a generational issue as well. I feel younger generation is more used to, but at the same time, what we have seen is that the trust toward the government has actually increased. So just a few weeks ago, the latest survey results came out. Over 95% of Estonians trust the government.
That's rare.
That's a huge number. But now, what is the situation with the private sector? 1/3 don't trust the private sector. So we have seen that towards social media platforms and so on, the trust is getting lower and lower. And as a result, there is 1/5 of Estonians that brought out they have decided to not use a service due to concerns over data use, and so on. So we are seeing kind of a change. Going back 6 years ago when I joined the government, the situation was basically different. So younger generation trusted the government, older generation didn't trust the government so much due to our kind of historical background, and the other way went for the private sector. Older generation trusted the private sector, younger generation didn't trust. Now it's trust towards the government, and increasingly people don't trust the private sector.
Before I move to our other panelists, I just want to push you on that. Mm-hmm. Why has that changed? Because like we were saying, that's rare to see. I mean, increasingly what it appears is that actually people are trusting government less. And that is why the sort of statements that we're hearing from Donald Trump are resonating actually with the American people, mm-hmm. because he's shooting from the hip, saying it as it is, and those are the sorts of things that people are saying, well, we're not necessarily getting from our politicians, from government.
So it's a difficult thing to kind of pinpoint why it's that, but I feel one side is definitely kind of everyone's interaction with the social media platforms, companies themselves as well. How many have used, for instance, Facebook Marketplace, have notified this is a potentially malicious seller, some articles that are kind of outfrank, just misleading.
But is it something
and nothing comes out of that
But
ever.
Is it something that the Estonian government has done over the course of the last 6 years to change that perception?
To be honest, this has been one of the most difficult things, because we have tried to outreach on multiple cases. So outright, just a few weeks ago, there was a story in the media as well, selling fake drugs to older or people. So our consumer protection and technical authority has outreach to Meta and other social media platforms on multiple cases. I've been involved as well, and later we can talk about the initiatives that we have actually done to address such cases, whether it is political advertisements or illegal advertisements altogether. It's extremely difficult because we don't have any control over the content, but at the same time, those companies are operating in EU, in various countries, and oftentimes kind of the bad side is we are hurting people's health, showing, vape or drug advertisements to young children, casinos, things that are illegal in every country, but unfortunately they go unnoticed, and there is nothing almost that the governments can do. We have seen that the number of illegal kind of notifications that we have provided has five-folded in a year. So it's a huge increase. We did a separate initiative on identifying different illegal advertisements. We started to scrape the different social media platforms because governments don't get any access to the open content. We are not talking about private communications. So governments are doing huge huge jumps. And at the same time, there is discrepancies as well. Many smaller countries, Estonia, Denmark, in Scandinavia, and so on, they haven't reached any consensus with the social media platforms, which a lot of this communication is taking place. While France, Germany, larger economies have access and have their own key account managers. So unfortunately, smaller economies, they have kind of an unfair advantage right now.
Dagmara, I'm going to come to you because I find that stat quite fascinating. Yeah. And the fact that increasingly we are hearing that people are losing faith and trust in politicians and in government, but Estonia's situation seems to be reversed. And from what I think that Ott was trying to say there was that actually perhaps people feel that the government in Estonia is fighting their corner against some of these social media giants, the information that's coming in, the content that might not be fake or be disinformation, and therefore the trust is being built.
Well, I think this is one of the reasons we have Estonia here on the stage, because they're an exception. The Estonian government is one of the most progressive governments in terms of understanding the consumer behavior, their values, beliefs, and developing value proposition to cater to that. But obviously the US is way more complicated, especially with the current presidency. And I run the International Advertising Association, and pluralism and diversity is at the core of our business behavior. We represent all of the sectors of the industry. So we have brands, we have platforms, we have media publishers as part of our membership. So as the result, we advocate for the whole industry to create a responsible ecosystem where brands and people can thrive. So we have a very kind of objective point of view when it comes to the industry. And we talk to platforms. We are engaged in a lot of initiatives to help develop this more responsible ecosystem, because brands, of course, are putting pressures on platforms because majority of the advertising revenue comes from brands. But it's very complicated, despite the fact that platforms put a lot of, and increasingly much more efforts towards creating more responsible ecosystem. It's to fight all of the things that we just described on a very granular level around the world. The amount of people they have been hiring to tackle this is already, immense. It's very complicated, but there is a desire, at least internally from what we know, to create a more responsible ecosystem. I think this is the ultimate goal, because ultimately everybody will benefit. The business will benefit and the people, but we are not there yet.
Help us understand the complications in the United States, of course, and with this administration, because you talk about people wanting to be more responsible, but certainly on Twitter or X now, I find I can't even look at my feed because it's so confused. I'm sort of, there's so much information coming my way. And as a journalist, we used to use it as a tool, but now I have to be extremely cautious about what I see on there.
Yes, and I think it's not easy to make a sense out of what's happening in the US right now. It's going to be very interesting times, I think, for the last 4 years. And I don't know if you listened to Elon Musk's interview at Cannes Lions last year. He very clearly sees the future of X as a platform to promote citizenship journalism. He believes that consumers actually and citizens are much more likely to seek the truth in the context of their communities than traditional media. And he used an example where he went in 2023 to the border, the US-Mexican border, to witness the migrants coming in from Mexico. And he interviewed a mayor of a town of 28,000 people, a town that had just experienced 7,500 people coming through to this town, completely disrupting the town. And he gave live interview with the mayor, and within 1 week he attracted 100 million viewers. And as the result, actually Biden was pushed to change policies against immigration to offset what was happening. So he has a point about citizen journalism and citizens really having the desire to seek the truth. However, you're absolutely right. When you look at the platform, it's very difficult to tell the difference between what's real, what's not. And this is true actually on Meta as well. So there is a big responsibility and opportunity for those platforms to really come up with AI solutions, product solutions, and algorithms to really to be very transparent.
I'm going to come back to you in a moment to push on substance on that, what that looks like in principle. But Mitali, I find this idea of citizen journalism really interesting, because I remember when I was starting in journalism, we used citizen journalists in places like Fallujah in Iraq, places we couldn't access. We would get the local community, people who were either local journalists or not, eyewitnesses to things, film it on their phones or on their video cameras. And we as journalists were able to then verify, spend time ensuring that what we were getting was the correct information. And then, take those citizen journalists' material and use it. But I think what Dagmara is talking about is something slightly different, or at least what Elon Musk is talking about is slightly different.
Thank you, Yalda. First, I want to sort of reflect on a couple of comments that were made earlier by speakers. One from the former president saying this isn't the worst time he's lived through, and I personally find that very encouraging because it feels like since 2019 it's been a race to the bottom. That's one. The second is that the comments that were made earlier about sort of just analyzing what the takeaways are from the Global Soft Power Index, and the fact that it's time to stop whinging and not to throw brickbats. I would actually argue that since the start of this year, it's been the complete opposite. It has been a race towards complete pliancy, whether we're talking about large technology platforms or indeed large media establishments that have very quickly fallen in line with what seems to be peak chaos politics, which is what we're seeing in the US at this point. The good news, if you will, is that this is not a new playbook. It's something that countries across the global majority nations, such as Latin America, Southeast Asia, South Asia, have plenty of experience with. It's something that has been played out for the last couple of years, and it is something that we are seeing in full form now in the US. I want to pick up the point you make about citizen journalism. We're taking a few steps back around the idea of trust, Yalda. So I think from our point of view and the research that we have done, which is largely around audiences and how they engage with news, trust and trustworthiness are two very, very different terms. So you can trust a particular position, such as the president of a particular country, but the individual may not in himself or herself be trustworthy. This is a similar problem, which is what the news industry has faced for many years now by losing large chunks of audiences where trust itself has been waning, particularly because they either felt one particular outlet or the other sort of resonated what they thought with. But I think the bigger problem is, and this probably sort of feeds back into politics and what governments should think about, which is complete hiving off of really large groups that now feel unrepresented, that feel unheard, and that frankly feel unimportant. This includes people from, sort of disadvantaged communities. This certainly includes the younger generation, and there is a very clear intersection in terms of how gender is often kept out of conversations, both around politics and news. The reason I bring this up is because I think your point is completely right about misinformation having existed for a long time. It is quite easy to, I think, sample it and set it when you're working with social media brackets, as opposed to reflecting on what's happening in society itself. This time round, when we analyzed audience data, we decided to ask audiences if they could clearly spot disinformation or fake news. Now, the first thing is, to their minds, it isn't the same thing as it is for us as journalists. It's not patently false. It's something that they find that they would like to mark as propaganda, or something that they aren't sure what the motivation behind that article might be. Almost 30% on TikTok, and this is worrying because this is where the younger generation is, said they find it very difficult to identify what might actually be misinformation. It is an almost as large number for the social platform X, which is 24%, which could be because of Elon Musk's sort of current very broad interpretation of what free speech looks like and what that's done to his algorithms. So I think when you go back to the time when you were sort of tapping into these resources as citizen journalists, perhaps it also reflected a different relationship with news at that point. And I think if we were to really not look at throwing brickbats or whinging and really talked about, what we can do to dig ourselves out of this situation back up, it's sort of going back to the brass tacks. It's reconnecting with audiences. There is enough research that points to the fact that those who have been engaged with news also by extension feel like they are a part of the political process. They feel more involved, more engaged, and they feel like they have choice. If we are to empower these communities, then we as a news industry, first of all, have to really go back and do the hard work. And I think that would be a very, very big starting step. Misinformation is somewhere down the line, but I feel like this one is the first big one.
So much to unpack there on, people who feel left behind. How do news networks and those with information reconnect with them? I guess news avoidance is a real thing as well. People are switching off because A, they're being flooded with information, and B, they don't know if the information they're getting is accurate, and C, they're finding the current climate quite depressing and difficult to digest, and therefore are turning away from the information that either social media companies or journalists are flooding them with.
No, you're absolutely right. That number has been ticking higher for us. This year it was as high as sort of 40 to 45%. At some point we decided to filter that in. We didn't want to consider those who say they don't engage with news at all, but then we found that the number was very large, and that needed to be taken into account. So there's certainly very high news avoidance that exists at this point. I will say two things. One is platforms come not without risk and with possibilities. So it's sort of a balancing game where news organizations have to decide whether or not they want to engage with that platform and be present on it, and whether they want to meet audiences where they are. Because the unfortunate truth is, at least for the last decade, this is where audiences have most often been engaging with news. They're not coming to the platform itself, by which I mean the news platform itself. They are sort of coming across news while they're on social media platforms. The other one, I think, is sort of, just working around these folk theories, Yalda, the ones that tend to feed news avoidance, which is, it's not the news, it's me, which is, I don't have the time for it, which is sometimes ideology, but often not. We find there's less sort of discrepancy between someone who identifies as left or right, and much more with people who just don't know where they stand on the political barometer. So I think these folk theories have to be unpacked. People have to feel like they're included and heard. I think it's sort of a huge motivation, particularly for public service broadcasters, to think harder about this, where continually we seem to serve the overserved. I think everyone in this room probably has 1 or 2 news publications that you subscribe to. You probably have a news habit, whether you check in the morning or the evening, you kind of try and keep on top of news. But you're not the majority, and I think that's what governments need to think about. When you think about soft power, it's also about how do we build inclusivity through education, access, literacy, all of it.
Which takes us to Ott, just picking up on what Mitali was saying there about the sort of uphill battle that governments also have, the challenges that I guess news organizations are currently facing, how to re-engage with those people who feel left behind, left out, and then elections are determined based on that moment of anger that they're feeling about their own situation, but what they're feeling towards government, and then as far as they're concerned, legacy media is now an extension of that almost.
So I'm just going to bring some of the kind of initiatives, approaches that we have taken. So I saw a huge surge actually during the COVID where things completely changed. So first of all, the question about what is truth or not. What are the different restrictions that the government has imposed? So we back then initiated this kind of central knowledge of truth. And it wasn't only for the government. We started to link that with also various private sector companies as well. So for instance, transportation companies, or one of the largest ferry operators in the Baltic Sea, Tallink, and the list went on. So disseminating information about what are the current restrictions. So it's not only about the government, but also collaboration with private sector and the central knowledge of truth, basically covering all the kind of most commonly asked questions that citizens had. So that was one end. But then the question also came up that we saw that different groups, so Russian-speaking population, others, they didn't have the same access to information. So similarly, people who had hearing impairment, so we developed real-time subtyping solution. Estimated in the beginning, 5,000 people are affected. In the end, over 200,000 Estonians affected, because many times people with children at home watch TV with voice toned down and so on. So it ended up affecting roughly 1/6 of the whole population. We provided funding to both our national broadcasting, but also to the private sector, different theaters, cultural venues, and so on, that please adopt this solution. Then the Ukrainian crisis, similarly, Estonian-Ukrainian machine translation, again for information dissemination, and to ensure that Ukrainians that have arrived to Estonia have access to all the government information. Took us a couple of weeks to develop because we had all the prerequisite data at hand. Now, sign language recognition. Again, there is a minority that have these impairments. So we can utilize technology itself to disseminate information and at the same time ensure that how we present information is correct. I feel that the kind of trust is the most important part right now for the government. And I feel that in Estonia, we are there to actually kind of lead the way. So when we talk about transparency, for instance, we developed data tracker, which provides an overview of how the government is actually processing your data, for what reasons, information that you need, proactive communication. So it's not only about paying taxes, but also your benefits, things that affect your life, crisis information sent to every citizen in a specific area. So it's a more complex side that we need to address.
I mean, I think the idea of transparency is really interesting, that has helped build trust by giving people information rather than sort of keeping it behind closed doors.
And actually, when we take, it was like close to 78-80% brought out transparency over data use is a key most aspect. When we talked about what is the key attributes related to personal state, so a state that really supports people, transparency, trust was the second. So this is kind of a really high aspect for everyone. And similarly, ownership over what information, how is provided, what services are provided. People want to decide themselves, so the government should enable that. And I unfortunately haven't seen any country besides Estonia that has taken such an approach on the transparency, really providing an overview of how data is being processed. Similar when we talked about the social media, news outlets, and so on, they should give the same possibility to really control over how your data is being used. What type of advertisements? Can your data be shared with external stakeholders? For us, we developed consent service, giving individuals really the possibility to control who and for what reason can access their data. So this in the end affects what type of services, what type of information is provided to you. So it's a more complex question than just dissemination or kind of digital skills. It's really about enabling as well.
Dagmara, again, Estonia is rare in this because...
They're the best in class, really, globally.
But the idea that other governments would use, and media outlets and social media would use transparency as a tool that's positive, because ultimately people then go seeking information elsewhere and they find themselves sucked into echo chambers where they want to hear or have what they believe reinforced. That's where we get into trouble.
Absolutely, and I think Estonia is the holy grail globally. And we've been looking at different cases. In the US, the system of regulation, self-regulation is very fragmented. There is some collaboration, but there is not a real collaboration of the whole ecosystem. And this is the biggest opportunity to really collaborate in a very transparent way to create an ecosystem where consumers and brands feel very comfortable and confident about the brand safety and consumer safety.
But why aren't they at present? Could you lay that out for us? Like, you know, the issue around transparency is something that governments, private sector, media don't necessarily want to put out there.
It's very complex. I think on one hand, a lot of government people in the US don't understand the digital space. They impose regulations that very often are not even up to date with the latest innovation. And I think the platforms also have created silos. They still don't share the data and the science behind the algorithm with the ecosystem, even with the media agencies and the advertising agencies. So there are efforts to overcome this, but right now it's still a very fragmented ecosystem. And on the top of this, only the highest value brands are involved in this discussion. They put demands. However, the medium and small businesses don't even understand the whole issue, and so they don't have even the resources to be engaged in this ecosystem. So I think the good news is that everybody understands that brands and consumers have to feel confident about the ecosystem. So there are efforts towards this, but I think it's complicated. We're involved in a lot of different work forces and collaboration initiatives with Meta, with TikTok, with Google, but there is no a comprehensive, integrated process, really. It's very siloed.
And I think that incompetence plays a huge role in these things as well. I think sometimes people think there's some great conspiracy theory when actually it's just people don't necessarily know what they're doing.
100%. 100%. And you know, we are in the business, the IA is in the business of analyzing the highest value brands in the world. And what the highest value brands in the world have in common is they have something called relentless relevance, meaning, to your point, they listen to consumers and they can react and come up with custom messages. And not surprisingly, the tech platforms are leading that engagement and are some of the highest value brands in the world. So I think there is a lot to learn for the traditional media players to really communicate, to develop products and ecosystems to listen to consumers more frequently and have them part of the ecosystem and the conversation. But they don't understand, I think those traditional players don't understand technology as well, obviously. So
we often see members of Congress, you know, questioning these tech leaders, and I think sometimes they just don't quite grasp what is happening or what's being discussed.
Yes. You know, it's a very complex issue. But I'm being positive and you know, I'm Polish, I'm very inspired by the President Wałęsa speaking. I think if we work together in a responsible way, we can really get to the point, and I really believe in the power of people as well. I really believe in consumers pushing brands, businesses. You know, my daughter is the biggest inspiration. My children, she's 18 years old. She takes 100% of her media, of her brand recommendation from TikTok, which terrifies me, of course. However, this is the reality. I think younger consumers are moving away from traditional media, yet they want to trust the platforms they choose. So I really believe they will have the power to pressure those platforms to come up with responsible practices.
I think, Mitali, you know, just listening to Dagmara talk about where her daughter, like so many young people, access their information now. Frankly, the truth is we are living in an age of authenticity. So more young people want to hear from someone that they can A, relate to, and B, you know, someone that they feel is being transparent, being authentic, might not necessarily have the right information, but that's where they gravitate to. And I guess it's an uphill battle for legacy media to try and break into that. And they have been trying. You know, the most sought after market is that younger demographic because publics, you know, broadcasters, those in the private sector are constantly trying to build their audiences because they know that legacy media, that medium, is something that is being left behind and we need to play catch up.
No, absolutely. And I think on the point of transparency, Yalda, at least in terms of what we have analyzed for audiences in news and what the barometer for transparency is, I think for news organizations, it's often lifting the curtains to the process. Here's how we go about our news gathering, and here's how we go about our news reporting. For audiences, it's something quite different. It is, what is the motivation behind this? What are the commercial interests that feed you or your organization? And that's what they see as sort of the larger transparency metric. So I think the first thing is to really bite the bullet and sit down and listen to these audiences. You're absolutely right. I think the younger generation does not feel represented and hence has moved to a platform of their choice. As news organizations, we have a choice. Shall we meet them where they are, or shall we wait for them to grow up, as they say, and then head to the news website itself? I would not sort of wager any money on the second outcome, because that hasn't been our experience over the last 10 years. I think one thing is important, and your point, sorry, about influencers is absolutely spot on. Late last year, we conducted a survey across 8 nations, including the US, and we found that for our sample survey, they actually trusted social media platforms more than they trusted journalism. I think it's sort of huge food for thought on what is happening in a deeply polarized state, news-wise, which is what the US is, and many other countries are, honestly. I think we need to sit down and think about this, because I want to make a broader point about why is this important. If you look at the playbook, if you will, for countries that have seen severe democratic backsliding over the last few years, there are always 3 pillars that get hit the hardest: civil society, academia, and journalism. Because these are the 3 pillars that have the capability to hold governments to question, to hold authorities to sort of transparency, and to demand answers. When these 3 pillars start crumbling, I think it has huge ramifications for the broader society. We're seeing that in countries like India, which is where I am from, and we are seeing that play out in the US as well. Just on your point about, why can't we build more value, I think it was quite shocking in the run-up to the elections how little conversation there was in mainstream media around how inflation was hitting consumers so hard and so personally. So frankly, at this point, I'd be keen for any news publication to every morning publish the price of eggs. Let's meet them where they are. Wasn't that the promise? That was the promise, right? I'm going to check inflation. I'm going to fix it all. Where are we with that? Are the prices of cars much cheaper in the last 3 months? I would reckon not. So I think, it really involves sort of having very deep and honest conversations, particularly with younger audiences, as you say.
That's a really, I was going to ask you what tangible steps media organizations now need to take to deal with this. And perhaps it's those little things, meeting people where they are. But we've certainly seen over the course of the last 15 months, the last 3 years since the war in Ukraine, the kind of flooding of disinformation that we've seen from the Russian side, hit certain markets. But then when the war in the Middle East broke out, there were a lot of young people who were questioning double standards, for example. Why is the media covering one war in one way and the other in a different way, the use of language? I know personally on my show, I was having a lot of young people come and confront me saying, you're not talking about the accurate numbers of death toll. But it is difficult for us news organizations because we adhere to certain values and we adhere to traditional methods in terms of how we've covered things. And yet out there in the media space, on social media, there are people doing long monologues about things, and that's clashing with what we're trying to achieve.
I completely empathize with you. It's a hard situation. You've worked for many decades and covered conflict. It's not easy. Sometimes it's also sort of parking your own personal beliefs to sort of work with the guardrails that a news organization has in place, and that's hard. And I think the whatever events we've seen across Gaza have really, really amplified that. Just to go back to that figure in TikTok, when we asked young audiences to identify where it was that they'd seen most misinformation, it was around events with the war in Gaza. It was around events related to COVID. It was very, very personal for many of them. So, you're absolutely right on that front. I think it's also sort of going back to what is the role of governments here. What can we set up in terms of editorial freedom and editorial moats where news organizations can report freely and frankly. And I think the reason there's this much sort of anger and an outpouring of it is, again, communities that do not feel reflected in the kind of news we've had so far. A dear colleague, Shirish Kulkarni, has led research at Media Cymru, where he's worked with a lot of disadvantaged communities, saying we often see journalism as almost equivalent to the police. We don't see ourselves represented in a fair fashion. And honestly, what's a panel without saying the word AI? But I think that might exacerbate the situation where you keep playing out the same tropes according to race or caste or community.
So we've got sort of 4.5 minutes left, but I guess, if I were to ask each of you, we can't look too far into the future. We can't predict the future. But this soft power summit will probably be here next year. If the people in this room were to think about one or two things that they could take away from this panel, tangible things, whether they're in the media space or whether they're in government or whether they're in some other sector, that they could take away, that they could potentially work on. I mean, I like the idea of the price of eggs, for example. It's something so small, but as a journalist, I'm sort of thinking, yeah, maybe those small things are things that we can remind the audience that we are thinking about the things that you're thinking about and not just in abstract terms. Go ahead.
And I think one single-minded idea I would share, and this is the obvious one, the role of AI. I really think AI can be a fantastic tool to help with engagement and can be a listening tool to understand all the needs of a very diverse groups of consumers and developing products against it to track content, develop content, optimize content. But AI innovation, I think, is a great opportunity for traditional media and for any media.
Engage in it and not be afraid of it.
Yes, to listen. To start with listening, to understand the needs, and to really track behaviors and attitudes and develop very comprehensive engagement strategy that goes just within your value system. Because, of course, as a media brand, I grew up loving and BBC, the Voice of America, and consumers don't just buy brands, they buy into brands, they buy into those beliefs. So stay within your value system. Our associations is guided by a North Star with very crystal clear value proposition, but use AI to really listen, to understand your ecosystem and develop products to address this. But AI could be a fantastic tool for that.
Mitali?
I would split it between government and journalistic industry, Yalda. So for governments, I think it's clear. If you believe democratic principles are worth fighting for, then you need to make space for that, even if it means that you yourself will be up for criticism. I know that takes a lot of spine, but it feels like if not now, then when? And for the journalistic industry, I would say it's actually, and not to sort of foray into your expertise, but it feels quite odd that an industry that is so consumed with reporting the news has done such a bad job of sort of advertising itself. People don't understand the very tangible value of what free and independent media means for societies. And I think that involves going out and talking to people. They feel quite well served with the top news items, but they don't feel well served in this fundamental idea of what is value. And I think that's the one we need to pick apart.
So I'm just going to extend customer contact analysis. So this really kind of took off during the COVID, understanding why actually people reach out to organizations. What is the current sentiment? What are the hot topics that are discussed in the social media wider? So this is one end. Then linking that with the engagement platforms. So for instance, when it comes to the policy side, we are right now kind of designing the next phase whereby, of course, we have collected always the information, opinions of everyone who wants to think along, but also how the different policies affect me personally. So if we are making any policy changes, how does it affect me as a business owner? How does it affect me as a small business owner? How does it affect me as an exporter? And the list goes on. So really personalizing the approach. And thirdly, I mentioned the upskilling as well. In 2018, when I joined the government, we actually started educating the media on data storytelling the importance of data management itself, availability of open data, and the list went on. So skills and competencies, not only on AI, but also data management, understanding trustworthy data sources from those which are not, how to disseminate information, and the list goes on.
Ott, Mitali, Dagmara, thank you all for joining me. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank my panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.